All right, so today we're diving deep into a story about fire. Well, it's more than just flames and smoke, though. We're going all the way to Australia to look at the Churchill fire. It's one of those, one of the many tragedies from those Black Saturday bushfires back in 2009. We're mainly using the Case File podcast for this deep dive, which really goes into detail about what happened that day. And, it's got these really powerful firsthand accounts from the people who were there.
You know what's really interesting about this story is it doesn't just tell you what happened with the fire. Like it really
Right.
makes you think about the human side of it all, the choices people had to make, how much they could really prepare, and how the community was affected, the long-term impact.
Yeah, it all started with this crazy heat wave in southeastern Australia. It was late January 2009. I mean, we're talking temperatures almost 50 degrees Celsius. That's over 120 Fahrenheit. And it wasn't just like a normal hot summer day. This heat wave was so bad it melted roads, messed up railway tracks, and even caused blackouts during the Australian Open.
And you're right, it wasn't just a little annoying. It was a huge warning sign. Australia gets bushfires, but this kind of heat, lasting so long, and then with the drought too, it was like a tinderbox just waiting to go up. By February, they were giving out catastrophic fire danger warnings. That's a level they'd never even used before.
I remember hearing about Black Saturday here in the States. The pictures were horrifying. Everything was just ash, and so many people died. So let's talk about Churchill. It's this town in the Latrobe Valley. It's surrounded by thick forests and plantations. What made it so vulnerable?
Well, Churchill was named after, Winston Churchill, and it's right in the middle of these eucalyptus forests. Those are like really flammable, and being so close to them, plus it being so dry and windy, meant any fire would just spread like crazy.
And that's exactly what happened. February 7th, just after 1:30 p.m., the fire started near a rural intersection, and like in minutes, it was huge. A pilot flying over said he saw this massive smoke plume just moments after it began. That's how fast it was growing.
The scary thing about bushfires is something called a wind change. It's when the wind suddenly changes direction, and it can completely change where a fire goes and how strong it is. And that's what happened in Churchill. The wind shifted and pushed the fire right at the town really hard.
The Case File podcast has these chilling stories from people who survived. They say the firestorm was like something out of this world, this incredibly loud roar, like a jet engine, and this gigantic wall of flames hundreds of feet high.
To understand how fast and strong this fire was, you have to think about what was burning. Remember those eucalyptus trees? They have these oils that are super flammable. They basically explode, and the fire can jump ahead of the main fire. They call them spot fires. And that's why it's so hard to stop a bushfire.
So you have this firestorm heading for Churchill, just ripping through everything. And people had to decide right then and there what to do. Some stayed to try and save their homes, others tried to get out.
And it's not like they had all the time in the world to decide. Things like their age, if they were healthy, if they'd been through fires before, and even, wrong information going around, all that affected their choices. Case File is great because it really digs into these individual stories. You can really feel how heavy these decisions were.
Let's hear some of those stories then. Case File tells us about the Friendos, this family that, well, they weren't really prepared. Alfred and Elaine lived with their son, Mark, who was disabled. Their older son, Scott, lived close by. They didn't really have a plan for fires. They thought their property was far enough from the bush to be safe.
Yeah, their story shows you that even when you get warnings, it's hard to understand the danger until it's too late. When the fire got closer, Elaine decided to take Mark and get out. Alfred and Scott stayed to try and protect the house.
They fought hard, but they didn't really have a plan, and the fire was just too strong. It's really sad because it shows you how important it is to have a plan, talk about it with your family, and know exactly what you'd do if you hear those sirens.
And then you have the Gibsons, two brothers, Colin and David. They were both firefighters, actually. They were at their parents' house that day. And they did everything they could to prepare. They cleared the gutters, hosed everything down. You put wet towels over the windows to try to block the embers.
Sounds like they were as ready as you could be, especially with them being firefighters. They even told their family they were safe and would leave if they had to. But then that wind changed.
Exactly. That's the scary part about bushfires. You can't always predict them. Even though they did so much, Colin and David got trapped when the fire changed direction so fast. They found their bodies in what was left of their parents' house. It's a really tough reminder that even if you're experienced and you prepare, you might not survive. The Gibson story, it just shows how powerful and unpredictable this firestorm was. And then there's the Jacobs family. They decided to stay in their garage. They'd actually designed it as a fire shelter. with supplies and a separate water tank.
So they had a plan and they thought they were safe. What happened?
Well, Alan and Miros Jacobs, their son Luke, and Luke's friend Nathan, they all huddled in the garage while the fire raged around them. The garage itself didn't burn down, but tragically they died from smoke inhalation. It shows you, even the best plans, sometimes they don't work in these extreme situations.
It's just awful to hear about these families and the choices they had to make. Case file also talks about Jenny and Glenn, who didn't want to evacuate right away. They thought they could watch and see what happened and leave if they had to.
Yeah, I get it. It's hard to leave your home, all your stuff. You want things to be normal, and when the danger feels far away, it's hard to just go. But the Churchill fire spread so fast that a lot of people, like Jenny and Glenn, were caught by surprise.
So what happened to them? Did they make it out okay?
Well, they did decide to evacuate eventually. They took Jenny's parents, who were older, with them. But in all the chaos of trying to get out, Jenny's mom, Annette, got separated from the group. They found her later. She had died trying to escape the smoke and the flames.
It's a reminder that even when you do decide to leave, getting out during a firestorm is dangerous, especially for, older people or anyone who can't move quickly.
Right. And then there are those who waited too long, like Martin Schultz. Even though his family and friends told him to leave, he kept saying he was fine, that he'd go if he needed to. But by the time he realized how bad it was too late.
Case file mentions his last phone call. It was terrifying. He was trapped in his car, saying the flames were all around him.
These stories are tough to hear, but they're important. They make us think about how we would react. It's easy to say, oh, I'd evacuate immediately. But when you're in that situation, your adrenaline's going, you're hearing all this conflicting information, it's hard to think straight.
For sure. And it's not just the fire itself, it's what comes after. The trauma, the grief, losing loved ones, homes, your whole way of life. It's unimaginable.
Absolutely. And while all of this was happening, people trying to survive, the authorities were trying to figure out how the fire started. It was pretty clear early on that this wasn't natural. They determined the Churchill fire was arson.
Wow, arson. That's just, that adds a whole other level to this tragedy.
The investigation was massive, one of the biggest in Australia's history. They called it Operation Winston. Hundreds of people involved. They were under so much pressure to find whoever did this, not just for justice, but to give some closure to the community.
So who did they think it was? Who was the suspect?
They focused on this local guy, Brendan Sokolik. He acted strangely, was obsessed with fire, and some people in town said he was kind of an outcast.
Case file talks about the evidence they had against him. What was the most compelling?
Well, a lot of it was circumstantial. He was seen near where the fire started. His story about where he was that day kept changing, and he even sent an anonymous email to the police trying to blame a firefighter for starting it.
That email, that sounds pretty damning. Did they find any physical evidence connecting him to the fire?
That's where it gets tricky. There wasn't any direct evidence, like DNA or fingerprints. But Sokolik did confess to starting the fire. The problem is, his confession was full of inconsistencies, which made it seem unreliable.
Wait, he confessed, but it wasn't consistent? How does that work?
Well, remember, Sokolik had autism and an intellectual disability. That made the investigation and the trial really difficult. Did he understand what he was doing? Was his confession real, or was he pressured into it?
So the prosecution was basically relying on this iffy confession and circumstantial evidence, and the defense was saying he was a scapegoat, a vulnerable person who got caught up in a community that was desperate for someone to blame.
Right.
Exactly. The trial was huge in the media because everyone felt so strongly about the case. The prosecution said Sokolik planned it, that he deliberately lit the fire. The defense said he was an easy target, someone who could be easily manipulated, who didn't really understand what he was doing. It's like a classic he said, she said situation. But then you add in Sokolik's cognitive abilities, and it gets really complicated. What about arson profiling? Case file mentioned that was part of the investigation, right?
Good point. Arson profiling is when they try to figure out who might be an arsonist based on how they act and their psychology. It can be helpful, but it's also controversial, especially when someone has cognitive differences.
Why is that?
Well, it relies on generalizations, statistics, so there's a risk of bias and making wrong assumptions. And with Sokolik, it was hard to tell if his behavior fit a typical arson profile or if it was just because of his autism and disability.
So you have this incredibly complex case, a community wanting justice, and a defendant who might not have understood what he did. What happened? What did the jury decide? This whole case is just, I don't know, I feel so heavy. You have the fire, the horrible loss of life, and then trying to figure out if it was intentional, was it an accident? And you have to think about Sokoluk's abilities, his mental state. It's just a lot.
Yeah, no, it really is. And it kind of shows you, I think, the limits of the legal system when you're dealing with mental health and disability. Like, how do you make someone accountable when they may not have understood the consequences of their actions the same way someone else would?
So what happened? What was the verdict?
Well, after a long trial and the jury talking it over for days, they found Brendan Sokolik guilty. 10 counts of arson causing death. He got 17 years and 9 months in prison. At the time, that made him, I think, Victoria's worst mass killer.
Wow, that's a long time. Did people think that was the right decision?
You know, it was mixed. Some people felt, yeah, that's what he deserved for causing so much damage. But others said it didn't really address, like, what his intentions were,
Yeah.
especially because of his autism and intellectual disability. And then there were people who thought that focusing on just him, even if he did start the fire, it took attention away from the bigger picture. You know, all the things that contributed to Black Saturday in the first place.
Yeah, Case File does talk about those things, like climate change, how well they prevented fires, and how they warned people.
Right, exactly. After Black Saturday, the Royal Commission, they made a bunch of recommendations,
Mhm.
like how to prevent fires, how to respond better. But they also said there's no magic bullet to stop these huge disasters from happening. Those fires were a wake-up call.
Uh-huh.
You know, extreme weather is happening more and more, getting worse and worse, and climate change is making it even harder.
It makes you think, what can we learn from this? What stuck out to you from the Case File episode? Any big takeaways?
I'd say being prepared is huge. We can't control the weather. We can't stop every fire.
Hmm.
But we can do things to lower the risk. Have a plan, keep your property clear, know how to evacuate if you need to. All of that can really increase your chances of survival.
I agree. And I also think it shows how important community is, supporting each other during and after something like this. These communities were just shattered, not just the physical damage, but the emotional toll too. It's amazing to hear how people were resilient, how they came together to help each other. It's just as powerful as the stories of loss, you know?
Yeah. And at the end of the Case File episode, they share this quote from a memorial service. Father Hugh Brown said, "The fire might have taken their homes, but it could take their memories, their gratitude, or their love."
It's really powerful, right? The human spirit can be so strong, even when facing something so awful.
It's a lot to take in, but it's an important story, not just for Australians, but for anyone living in areas where wildfires happen, or any kind of natural disaster, really. The Churchill fire reminds us how powerful nature is, how people act in a crisis, and how important it is to have community, resilience, and hope.
And it makes each of us think, what can we do to be ready for the unexpected? How can we support our communities? How do we build a future where we can handle these increasingly unpredictable events? That's a great point to end on. So, as we finish this deep dive into the Churchill fire, it leaves us with a lot to think about. What struck you the most from the stories we've talked about today? And maybe even more importantly, what can you do in your own community to make a difference when it comes to preparing for and dealing with disasters?
Remember, knowing things is only really useful if you act on it. Let the stories of the Churchill fire make you think, make you prepare, and recommit to building stronger, more resilient communities.